Over the next 4 years, the NHS faces quite a big challenge with its budget. On the face of it, you might think that's not true. There are very deep cuts to most spending departments under this government's plans that wants to get the deficit down. And the NHS has been relatively protected, its budget's being frozen. But a real terms freeze is incredibly different to what the NHS has been used to. It was increased dramatically under the Labour years and in fact has grown very strongly over the last 60 years. And if the government does manage to keep to its plans of roughly freezing the NHS budget for 4 years, that will be the tightest NHS settlement for 50 years. So the least optimistic scenario in terms of what the NHS gets is we assume that the NHS continues its real freeze, so its budget only grows in line with economy-wide inflation right the way through up to 2021-22. The most optimistic scenario we look at is one where after this Parliament, after the 4 year of real freeze, the NHS returns to its average increase, an average of 4.0% a year each year after inflation. And then we have a scenario that sits in the middle, which says that we have the 4 year freeze in spending, and after that, NHS spending grows in line with real growth in the economy. That's growth of about 2.4% a year. So clearly over the 10 years as a whole, it would be growing less than the economy. And we think that's probably the most plausible scenario to look like. If we do deliver the real freeze over this Parliament and then increase NHS spending in line with national income, that would mean that spending on the NHS in 2021-22 had grown. It had grown more quickly than most other public services over this period, but it would still be very challenging for the NHS. It's used to increases of 4% a year on average over the last 60 years. 2.4% a year would be much less than what the official numbers suggest are needed just to keep pace with the cost of a rising and ageing population. So even our most central scenario is not one that's particularly rosy for the NHS, and what we're trying to stress here is it isn't just a 4 year squeeze and then back to what the NHS is used to. It's likely to be a much longer period where the NHS is having to deliver more outputs to an older population with its inputs growing less quickly. Given how much money we want to spend on the NHS, we need to think very seriously about what that can really provide in terms of what services are provided free at the point of use to whom. If the budget looks very tight, which it does, the best thing to do presumably would be then to pick carefully exactly what it is you're going to provide free at the point of use, exactly what kind of things are not going to be provided, and possibly what things you might want to extend charging to. So we charge for some things in the NHS, are there other things that you should charge more for? An alternative is to say, well, actually, we want to have more things free at the point of use, in which case we need to spend more than, say, our central scenario. That requires higher taxes or lower spending elsewhere. Perhaps the worst case scenario is to pretend that we can have all the things that we want to have free at the point of use and not have to pay more in terms of taxes or cutting other public services. If we do that, and we believe that productivity gains can do it, if those productivity improvements don't materialise, what happens is you end up with the NHS trying to do too much for its budget, and it does too much not very well. So if we assume that the government completes its reduction in the deficit, gets that down to sustainable levels and then keeps it there, and we think the NHS is going to go along this scenario with a real freeze for 4 years and then its budget grows in line with GDP, what that means is the government would need to deliver its planned additional cuts to welfare spending. The Chancellor mooted £10 billion in his budget speech. He'd have to do that. He would also then have to squeeze other public services and increase their budgets by just 0.6% a year on average in real terms. An alternative is he might think that other public services need 1% a year to keep up with what the public wants there. If you need to do that and you keep to our NHS central scenario, you're going to have to double those welfare cuts, or alternatively look for tax rises of the magnitude that would be brought in by another 2 percentage points on the main rate of VAT.